From around the world, wherever you are, we welcome you and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring a very difficult topic for me. It's actually talking about the sexualization of children in the media. This is a very tough topic to deal with, but we have a wonderful guest today that really specializes in this area. He is Dr. Barrie Gunter, coming from England. He is a professor of mass communication at Leicester University in the Department of Media Communications. Welcome to the circle, Dr. Gunter.
Hello, pleased to join you.
It's about, 5 o'clock over there in England right now?
5 o'clock in the evening here, yeah.
Wow. So we're going to talk today about sexualization of children. Dr. Barrie Gunter's book is right here. It's an excellent book if you really want to get an understanding of what's going on with our kids in the media. So Dr. Gunter, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, it's been a topic that's been widely debated in the UK and also in other parts of the world, and there have been a number of government inquiries in the US and also over here in Britain and in other countries like Australia. A lot of concern about the infiltration of sexual imagery and sexual themes in all kinds of merchandise and different forms of entertainment that's targeted at children, and not just children who are already sexually mature, but children who are not yet sexually mature, who are under the age of 10, who don't understand matters of sexuality, but nevertheless are introduced to them in subtle ways, often through branded products and also through forms of entertainment which are targeted at them. And so they're introduced to this idea of sex before, if you like, they're ready to deal with it in terms of their own maturity. And there's a lot of concern about that, not least because also it's seen as in terms of turning children into sexual objects, providing a source of encouragement, if you like, to adults who have, unfortunately, the wrong kinds of ideas about children, who are sexually attracted by children. And there's a lot of concern about those sorts of activities as well. And also children themselves, once they start to become sexually aware, are behaving in more extreme ways in terms of how they use sex to evaluate themselves. And that's not seen as a healthy development, particularly when the children themselves are not yet mature enough to cope with the pressures that this sort of trend can bring about in their lives.
Do we have any longitudinal studies about this?
Well, the research derives from a whole range of different types of study. In terms of longitudinal studies, not a lot of work of that kind. It tends to be short-term work. I think that's really an outcome of the kinds of funding which is available to researchers to do this sort of work. There have been trends that have been monitored in the media in terms of the extent to which programs that are targeted at children on TV channels that are targeted at children or magazines that are targeted at children have seen an upsurge in the extent to which sexual references are being made. So there are those kinds of trends which have underpinned the growing concerns in that this is a more commonplace kind of activity to which children are exposed. But in terms of following through the longer term effects on children, that's a more difficult thing to do, particularly with a subject such as this, which raises all kinds of ethical problems for researchers who are trying to deal with a very sensitive issue with an age group where it's always very difficult to get access anyway to ask certain kinds of questions of them. So it is difficult to do anything more than short-term research usually because of those kinds of barriers that are put in the way, especially if you want to try to manipulate children's circumstances to see whether in controlling the levels of exposure to different types of material that results in certain kinds of outcome. I think with an issue of this kind, you cannot really engage in that kind of research readily. Where you're dealing with a very sensitive issue, you've got to be very careful about how you approach it with children. And if there's a suspicion that researchers are, if you like, introducing sexual themes into the lives of children in order to investigate them, that in itself would be seen as a potential source of harm. So it's very difficult to follow through over time specific influences that the media or merchandise might have and separate those effects from the effects of a whole range of other developmental experiences that children have. So researchers have found this very challenging. Usually the longer term research has been focused very much on the trends in the media or trends in merchandising, where there's been a growth seen in the extent to which sexual references or sexual themes are now present within those kinds of life experiences of children. And that is seen increasingly as a matter of some concern, particularly as there are concerns about child abuse. And certainly in the UK, there have been a number of very high-profile media cases of child abuse involving, in some cases, celebrity figures who seemed at the time to be untouchable in terms of what they were doing. And so this has created a great deal of sensitivity about how children are socialized and how children are protected from all kinds of threats which the public believe now are very prevalent, perhaps more prevalent than they really are, but these high-profile cases have raised in the public's mind the risks now which children face from sexual predators.
What's your opinion about Barbie dolls, the princesses that we've seen? This seems to be a common theme here in the U.S. I'm not sure if it is in the U.K. or not.
Yeah, well, these are global brands, and you'll find them in the UK. You'll find them all over the world, not just in the US. This is an area of some concern as well, because these are, I mean, kids have played with toys, for generations, and nothing inherently wrong with that. But these are toys which children dress up and which often have physically mature body shapes, and they're drawing young children's attention to the sexual appeal of the toys, if you like, and therefore in drawing attention to sexual references which very young children at whom these products are targeted are not yet ready to deal with, it can sometimes create, for some critics anyway, an unhealthy theme which young children are, it is claimed, are not yet ready to deal with. I mean, I think it depends very much on the child. It depends on how their parents socialize them. It depends on the way in which they play with these kinds of toys. But nevertheless, in terms of fashion and merchandise and toys, the kinds of products which are being targeted at very young children under the age of 10, there are more and more sexual references being found and sexual themes being found as characteristic of these items which children are often engaging with. And so the concern is that it's introducing the idea of sex and sexuality at a very early age before children perhaps are ready to cope with those ideas, and also drawing attention to the importance of sexuality as a definer of who you are as a person. And that also is not always a healthy thing to introduce children to until they're ready, until they begin to sexually awaken in their adolescent years.
That's something you mentioned off camera. We talked about self-esteem.
Yes.
You think it hurt?
Well, that's right. I mean, I think if there's an emphasis, and I think one of the main areas of concern here is beauty pageants for very young kids. These are very popular in the US. They've become increasingly popular in the UK as well, and in other parts of the world. A lot of the proponents of these events would say there's absolutely nothing harmful about them at all. The kids have a good time. They're well taken care of. They've got their parents there with them. But the critics of these sorts of events would say, well, yes, but you're dressing up very young children in a very mature way, and you're drawing attention to them in a sexualized way by putting makeup on them and making them wear costumes which would normally be associated with adults. And for the kids themselves, you're drawing their attention to how they look and how they define themselves in terms of how they look, and you're placing a high value on looking good. Now, yeah, we all want to look good, and there's nothing wrong with taking pride in yourself. But if your self-value is defined predominantly by how you look, and you judge other people in that way as well, and you learn to do that from a very early age, and if also the definition of how good you are as a person depends upon whether you wear the right styles and the right brands, that is not always a healthy way to socialize kids, because there's more to who you are as a person than what you wear and how you look. And so there are concerns of those kinds as well. And again, there are sexual themes running through these competitions, which critics would say are, they're unhealthy because of the age of the kids who are taking part.
I guess my last question on this subject matter, and then we're going to explore a little bit about media violence. Why do people like to see children in this capacity?
Well, I think it is, parents are behind it, and I think parents have a degree of responsibility here. We often hear the media blamed for introducing to kids all kinds of images and themes which they're not yet ready to deal with, but the major mass media tend to be fairly responsible and are tightly controlled. But where you've got parents introducing their kids to the idea of dressing up and valuing themselves through how they appear, then it kind of endorses, if you like, that this is the norm that you should adhere to. And so, but I think the parents themselves get a kick out of it also. They like to see their kids winning competitions. It makes them feel good. And there's a competition between the parents, to put forward a child who, if their child is more talented and more attractive than your child, and that kind of competition I think exists for the mums and dads, particularly the mothers who tend to travel around with the kids. And yes, the kids can win prizes, and there are often these sort of material incentives as well to participate. But I think really it's about the self-esteem of the parent as much as it is the child here, and children sometimes can feel unduly pressured to perform well and to look good in these competitions. Otherwise, their parents and all their mother is perhaps not very happy with them, and so it can create an unhealthy tension among the parent and child. Now, of course, I'm sure there'll be mothers watching this interview who will disagree with what I'm saying here. Will say, well, we our kids go into beauty pageants, they have a good time, they meet other kids, they like to dress up. It's all perfectly harmless fun. Maybe it is, but nevertheless, when you see the way 4 and 5-year-olds, and sometimes kids as young as 2, are being dressed up like adults and being given makeup, which you'd normally associate with grown women, it is drawing a certain kind of attention to certain features of a child, which perhaps they are too young really to be treated in that way. And therefore, serious questions, I think, have to be asked about not just how responsible, properly civilized people would react to those kinds of images, and they would still see them as children, but how perhaps more warped minds belonging to people who prey on children might be fed and might be fueled by these sorts of events and the images that come from them, which are often widely publicized in the media.
Now, we have about 4 or 5 minutes left here, and I know you wrote another great book. You're a prolific writer, and you wrote a book about media violence and how that impacts us. And if we have even if we run out of time, we can always put into part 2 and continue it a little bit more there.
Yeah.
Can you start talking to us a little bit about the media violence and how that's impacting us?
Well, media violence is probably the most researched media subject of any, and there's been a huge volume of research carried out over perhaps 80 to 90 years. The first investigations can be traced back to the 1920s, when there were early concerns about the possible impact of the early silent movies. And indeed, at that time, there was research done by an organization called the Pain Fund, which said that movies are obsessed with sex and violence and crime. And that concern has been echoed over the decades with each successive new medium that's come along. Television has been a particular target here, where there have been concerns about the prevalence of violence on television and the possibility that it can influence people in terms of their attitudes towards aggression and in terms of their own behavior. And a lot of the research has been geared to determining whether exposure to violence on television or in film can produce harmful reactions among viewers, whether it can frighten them, whether it encourages them to internalize certain violent behavioral scripts, which they will reenact themselves later on, whether it triggers them immediately to respond aggressively, or whether simply the general experience of violence in a very violent medium, as television is often accused of being, can have a cumulative effect, desensitizing people.
Before you get to the answers of those questions you just brought up, I think that's a great segue to part 2.
Hello, my name's Matt, and I'm an addict. My mom was addicted to prescription pills when I was very young, before I even turned 1.
Are you or someone you know struggling with alcohol or drug addiction? Has everyone given up on you or your loved one? The caring staff at Elite Care understands and treats you as a whole person. We offer individual and group therapy, holistic healing such as yoga, nutrition, and spirituality, medication management, and PTSD treatment. By building upon your strengths and rebuilding broken bonds, we help you begin a successful life. With our staff of licensed psychotherapists and doctors, you can be assured of the highest level of care. Elite Care is the best option for long-term rehabilitation from drugs and alcohol. Contact 888-511-0607 for more information.
We left the crowd hanging here with some of the potential answers. Does media violence have an impact on society? So I wanted to get back to those questions and find out, does it really influence us at all? Or is this just kind of make-believe?
Well, no, it's not make-believe, and there are some people who believe that violence in the media, particularly violence on television and film, can have very powerful effects on us. I mean, I think without a doubt it can affect us emotionally, but the real concern is whether it causes long-lasting harm. Does it turn us into more violent human beings? And there's a huge amount of scientific evidence on this, which unfortunately it doesn't reach a consensus view. Although most of the researchers in the US would argue now, I think, that there is sufficient evidence to show that at a fairly low level that regular exposure to violence in the mainstream media can have a lasting impact on people by perhaps causing them to think that there's more violence in the world than there really is, and also perhaps making them more desensitized to violence and perhaps more prone to use it occasionally if they're intimidated. But like I say, this is a highly contentious issue, and not all researchers are in agreement about it. And my view is that you have to look very carefully at the evidence and the way the evidence was obtained in the first place. And there's a combination of types of methods that have been used. Some researchers have simply surveyed people to get them to report back on their media experiences and their likelihood of behaving aggressively in different situations. But we're never quite sure how valid those responses are when you're reliant on people's memories of what they've watched on TV at different times and their honesty in terms of telling you how they're likely to behave in different situations. Then in addition to that, there are interventionist studies, experiments, which have attempted to manipulate people by showing them certain kinds of scenes and then seeing how subsequently they're likely to behave and whether they're likely to copy what they've seen and whether they're likely to be more aggressive towards another person in a controlled laboratory environment. And there's evidence from those kinds of studies to show that there can be short-term triggering effects of exposure to media violence on the way people will behave towards others, particularly if those other people have also behaved in an unpleasant way towards you before you viewed the violence itself. So there's a lot of research going on still. The focus of attention now has shifted from television onto video games, and in the last 10 years, a lot of the research that's been done has been focused very much on whether playing violently themed video games can have the sorts of effects which televised violence was previously accused of having. And again, the same kind of contentious issue. Lots of disagreements between researchers about whether video game violence can or can't have effects on players. I think that, as a general observation, what I would say is that most people, most of the time, are not adversely affected by media violence. Most of us, if we're properly socialized, have learned how to control our aggressive impulses. But there's no doubt that if you're exposed to violently themed entertainment on a regular basis, that you can internalize certain violent scripts. In other words, you see how violent incidents are played out. We would tend as viewers to interpret that violence in respect of, particularly if it's in a drama, the context in which it occurred. In other words, who was the perpetrator? What was motivating them? Were they justified in their actions? Or was there a disproportionate use of violence given the situation which was being played out at the time? So the the early research which derived from behavioral psychology, which tried to develop a model of stimulus response, that is, that you see the violence and then you behave aggressively, that's been shoved to one side now, and there's a more complex cognitive psychological modeling view that we internalize the things we see and we place our own interpretations, not just on individual incidents, but on entire scripts or sequences of behavior. And we determine whether, in fact, the things that we see on the screen are going to be relevant to us in the future in terms of behavioral choice. So that if you were to experience violence in the real world, do you then become less upset by it and more accepting of it? And that is where there's a concern in terms of the potential harm in relation to desensitization. The evidence on desensitization effects is quite thin. There is some research evidence to suggest that it can occur, but I think it's not robust enough for us to get unduly concerned about that kind of outcome. Where I think there is more robust evidence is in terms of how our views of the world can be changed by our television and other media experiences. Vision doesn't mean that we'll go out and then reenact them. Most of us will never do that.
Well, that might be good news for the producers of Prime Suspect and MI6 and all those other shows out there, as well as here.
Yeah.
Quick question. I always hear this. People say the negative effects are thinking there's too much violence out there, the desensitization, as you mentioned. But what does that do to us if we did have those issues?
Yeah, well, I think desensitization is one thing, and the cultivation of fear is something else. Desensitization is about not responding in if you like, an emotionally responsible way to unpleasant scenes. So most of us, if we experienced violence for real, we would be genuinely and perhaps seriously upset by it. And it would be a memory that wouldn't leave us easily. When we experience it on television, it's at a distance. We might still see scenes on television that are very upsetting to us. But if we have repeat exposure to scenes of that kind, psychologically we learn to adapt. We don't respond as strongly through successive experiences of initially upsetting material. It's a way of us coping with our environment generally and fear-invoking experiences. And a lot of this research came from the US. If you take American primetime network television drama, a lot of that has been characterized by crime and violent themes over the years. So the argument goes, American viewers are watching this material, and perhaps if they draw upon it in terms of informing their views about the world, television is a much more violent world than the real world that most people know. But if they start to believe that the real world is a bit like television, then they might begin to see the real world as more violent than it really is, and as less safe than it really is. And if people feel less safe, they might take steps then to protect themselves, which they wouldn't otherwise do. Or they might withdraw from society. They might stay home and not go out because they're afraid to expose themselves to a threatening world. They might become more security conscious. Parents might be less inclined to let their kids go out to play because they're afraid of what might happen to them, and so on. So there are all kinds of potential behavioral repercussions which might build up cumulatively over time as a result of experiencing a world of television which doesn't represent the real world.
Let me ask you this. I'm going to do a little twist here on the desensitization part of it. Is it possible that it could actually help individuals such as paramedics, police officers, military soldiers, because they don't get as affected by violence when they have to see it?
Well, yes. I mean, the original research about desensitization was really, it was about emotional habituation to upsetting scenes. And the original studies were looked at how people responded to real accidents where people were seriously injured, for example, at work. Now, if you're a person who is employed to deal with the aftermath of those kinds of incidents, you can't throw up your hands in horror and say, oh, this is upsetting, it makes me sick, I'm going to run away, I'm not going to help you. If you're working for the emergency services, clearly you've got to engage, you've got to switch off a normal emotional reaction to a very serious injury where somebody's got a broken bone or is bleeding or is about to lose their life. You've got to stay cool and calm, and you've got to react. Now, getting into that psychological state doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen straight away. You've got to get acclimatized to dealing with those kinds of scenes. And so there are training videos that paramedics and other emergency service professionals might engage with as part of their training, which gets them used to. I mean, it won't get them all the way because real experiences are not the same as mediated ones, but it's a kind of training that can be used to get them used to those scenarios so that they don't react in an emotional way, which clouds their judgment and means that they're unable then to carry out their duties as they're trained to do. So there is a positive side to emotional coping through emotional habituation to horrifying scenes. Where there's a concern is if that kind of coping mechanism occurs more generally as a result of exposure to certain types of regular entertainment content, which contains themes which resonate with real-world experiences, where we might want a person, to be able to engage with entertainment and enjoy it, but at the same time not to develop a view of the world which makes them very cynical when they go out into the real world, and if they experience real world incidents of violence, we hope they will respond differently from the way they respond when they're watching violence in entertainment. And this is the concern, whether there's a transference of coping from media experiences into real world experiences. Sometimes this can happen, sometimes it can't. It really does depend on the individual, and it also depends on the proximity between what they're experiencing in the media and real world experiences. So a lot of violence on television occurs in fictional scenarios which are quite distant from everyday reality for people. That distance is a source of protection for them because they will not identify with the entertainment world as something which is relevant to their real world. Where you have television and other media experiences, however, which come close to their real world, perhaps in the news, where you've got news of real world events, or perhaps in very realistic drama, in contemporary settings, with realistic characters who you relate to, who seem like people you know in your own life, the closer to everyday reality and entertainment experience is, the more likely it is to influence your view of your real world, because it's seen as relevant to informing your views of your own world. Okay?
Now we're down to about our last 2.5 minutes here. I got one question before we actually give you a fastball question. So
okay.
You have to prepare for that one. But before the fastball question, Sherlock Holmes, would he classify in this area?
Well, it depends on the version of Sherlock Holmes that you're watching. Sherlock Holmes is a detective and he deals with crimes, sometimes violent crimes, but it's a case of how they're played out in whichever dramatic narrative version of Sherlock Holmes you're talking about. There are Sherlock Holmes films, there are Sherlock Holmes TV series, and some of them are very sanitized in that they will not show any overt violence, and others are less that way. They will show violence more overtly. I think often with Sherlock Holmes, however, the audience's involvement is less to do with the overt violence, more to do with the clandestine threat, if you like, the threat that exists from Holmes's enemies, that something might happen to him where he might come unstuck, where there's a danger lurking around the corner, but there's no overt violence ever shown. And I think that's how the audience is drawn in emotionally. But I don't think you can take a character and it's the same you could say with James Bond. You could say, well, James Bond is a very, very violent man. And indeed, the way the character was it was originally written about, James Bond was envisaged as a ruthless operator. It's not always portrayed that way in the movies. The Roger Moore James Bond is not the same as the Timothy Dalton James Bond. It's not the same as the current James Bond. And the Sean Connery James Bond perhaps was one of the most ruthless of them all. So the same character can be played out in different ways by different actors and in different films, depending upon the mood of the times. There may be more or less overt violence. And a lot of the violence which occurs in films of that kind is very carefully choreographed anyway, and is not taken terribly seriously or seen as relating to people's everyday reality. So, people can enjoy that sort of entertainment but it's not going to have any lasting harmful effect on them.
Good news for Sherlock, good news for Bond fans. Here comes the fastball question. Are you ready, Professor?
Yeah.
Now, you are at the University of Leicester, the Department of Media and Communications in England.
Yes.
So the question we want to know is, why do so many British actors take leading roles in our TV shows in the U.S.?
I think it's because you pay better.
Well, there you go. He hits the ball out of the ballpark. That's a great answer from Dr. Gunter. I think maybe one of the messages we can take out of this show today is everything should be done in moderation and awareness of what our shows that we are watching can have on us. Is that safe to say?
Well, that's right. Yes. I mean, I think most people are sensible, well brought up, and can enjoy entertainment even with violent themes without taking those themes away with them and using them in their own lives. They can separate a fantasy world from a real world, and they know how to behave in the real world, and they can enjoy violent entertainment without it encroaching on their real world at all. Where there's more concern is that there are some people who are not like that and can feed off entertainment violence. That might further fuel their existing aggressive impulses. But they're a very tiny minority of people. And if they didn't feed off television, they'd find some other source of endorsement of their behavior to feed off.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gunter, once again for being on the circle. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, whether it's Criminal Minds or Sherlock Holmes, we are there. We'll see you next time, everyone.